Trudeau did his statement from the cottage, his little soap opera he has going with the media. But MP Brassard really takes the Liberals to task. McKenna and that Heritage Minister guy, he really goes at heart. It's all about the infrastructure bank and how it hasn't put any money out. Now they have a new guy. Will it be just round two of the same?
This goes to Mr. Brassard. Mr. Brassard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Last week, the President of the Treasury Board wrote a letter to his cabinet colleagues in which he said that as the federal minister responsible for public access to government information, that he's advised his cabinet colleagues of the need for transparency and accountability even in times of crisis. So my question is to the Minister of Infrastructure and Communities. Does she agree with the President of the Treasury Board's directive?
Maintaining the openness and transparency of our government during this challenging time. The Government of Canada, along with provincial and territorial governments, have implemented exceptional workplace measures to curb the spread of COVID-19 and to protect the health and safety of federal employees. These measures have had an impact on institutions' ability to respond to access to information and personal information requests, since most employees are now working from their homes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
We'll go back to Mr. Brassard. Mr. Brassard.
Frankly, surprised that the answer is coming from that minister when the Minister of Infrastructure is in the House, but I will ask this question. Can the minister tell Canadians who Pierre Lavalley is?
It's a committee. The Honourable Minister.
Treasury Board Secretariat has provided guidance to institutions to continue to make the best efforts to respond to Access to Information Act and Privacy Act requests and to provide published content.
Go back to Mr. Brassard. Mr. Brassard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can the Minister of Infrastructure and Communities tell us who Pierre Lavalley is?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, of course, Pierre Lavalley was the former CEO of the Canada Infrastructure Bank. We are very proud that we now have Michael Sabia, who is the new chair of the Infrastructure Bank. He did a fabulous job in Montreal.
Now go back to Mr. Brassard. Mr. Brassard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can the minister tell me how long Mr. Lavalley was the CEO of the Infrastructure Bank?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I can't give you the exact months. He was the CEO of the Canada Infrastructure Bank since the beginning. But let's be clear. Crown corporations work at arm's length for the government and must have flexibility.
Return to Mr. Brassard. Mr. Brassard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can I ask the minister how well she knows her file? 50%, 75%, or 100%?
The Honourable Minister.
Quite a condescending little comment. I'd like to say that I know my file very well. And you know what I know is that Canadians want infrastructure built. They want it built across the country in the member opposite's riding and in ridings across the country. They want cleaner, healthier, more connected.
Go back to Mr. Brassard. Mr. Brassard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. How much of the $35 billion of infrastructure money that was allocated to that bank has been spent so far?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Infrastructure Bank is a new, more flexible financing model for infrastructure investments. It was set up. It is now in its new phase. We're very excited it's going to be moving forward, and stay tuned.
Mr. Brassard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And in the context of Mr. Duclos' advice to his cabinet colleagues about openness and transparency, I'd like to ask the minister, how much was Mr. Lavalley paid annually?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I said, Crown corporations work at arm's length for the government. Our government follows the Privacy Act and Access to Information Act when it comes to employee compensation. But remuneration ranges are publicly available, and I'd note that this information for the bank CEO has been in the public domain.
Back to Mr. Brassard. Mr. Brassard.
So I'm asking the minister, Mr. Chair, how much Mr. Lavalley made. There was no answer to that. If it is in the public realm, she should know that. She said she knows her file very well. How much of a bonus was Mr. Lavalley paid recently when he left on April 2nd?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I am not involved in HR discussions when it comes to the Canada Infrastructure Bank and Mr. Lavalley. Crown corporations work at arm's length from the government. They need to have flexibility and meet their commercial mandates. And as I say, the information about salary ranges is publicly available, but personal HR.
Back to Mr. Brassard. Mr. Brassard.
So how many, Mr. Speaker, could you stop I'm hearing.
Joining us virtually to mute, s'il vous plaît, tous les députés qui nous...
I would ask all the members who are with us virtually to mute.
Okay, now, Mr. Brassard, there's about 15 seconds left. I'll give you a very short question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. According to a table, Mr. Lavallee could have received a bonus after year one of 0 to 75% of his base salary, which was $510,000 to $600,000 per year, or in year two, which he was in, 0 to 120% of his base salary. How much of a bonus did he receive?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The rate of any remuneration paid to the Chief Executive Officer is based on the recommendation of the Board. Our government follows the Privacy Act and Access to Information Act when it comes to employee compensation. But let me say this, that we're very excited about the new phase of the Canada Infrastructure Bank. We have Michael Sabia there as the new board chair, that we need to move forward on.
We'll now continue to Mr. Chong. Mr. Chong.
Thank you, Chair. Parliament's now been suspended for 3 months since Friday, March 13th.
Did you, like us, expect more for this infrastructure bank? I expected them to be throwing money everywhere and this and that. Leave your comments down below. Like, subscribe. Always. Have a good day and stay frosty.